on World News Tonight. Continuing assault. Major repercussions may ensue as Russia goes nuclear, striking down and capturing Europe's largest nuclear power plant. The world watches on in fear of a possible nuclear meltdown unlike anything seen before. Probing the panic. The International Criminal Court has now begun its own investigations into possible war crimes committed by Russia. Despite such stern warnings, the country proceeds with its relentless advances. Catastrophic floods. Australia's unprecedented deluge has caused acres of land to go under, leaving thousands at the mercy of Mother Nature as efforts continue to salvage what's left. And conquering the ice. Figure skaters do what they do best by leaving audiences awestruck with spectacular performances.
This is Derana World News Tonight. Reporting from Colombo, here is Anuradhi Vikramasinghe.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us on World News Tonight. We begin tonight's broadcast with nuclear escalations on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is appealing for urgent help amid reports that Russian forces have shelled Europe's largest nuclear plant. Let's cross over to Derana World News special correspondent Malsha Pathiraja from Kursk in Russia for more. Malsha?
Yes, Anuradhi. Slowed down security camera footage from Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant appears to show a fire at Europe's largest nuclear facility. According to Mayor Dmytro Orlov of nearby Enhento, continuous enemy shelling of the plant's buildings and units seemed to cause a fire at the nuclear station. Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russians of deliberately shooting at the Zaporizhzhia plant's 6 reactors using tanks equipped with thermal imaging. Invoking the global catastrophe at Chernobyl in 1986, he warned the consequences of a meltdown at Zaporizhzhia would be far worse. U.S. Secretary of the Energy Jennifer Granholm has tweeted that she spoke to Ukraine's energy minister about the fire at the Zaporizhzhia plant and has decided to activate the U.S. nuclear incident response team. Ukrainian emergency services have confirmed they have managed to put the fire at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, a huge relief to everyone in the area and beyond, as fighting at the location also ceased. While civilian casualties have not been reported, Ukrainians confirmed that Russia has taken over the area. Back to you, Anuradhi.
All right, thank you. That was Derana World News special correspondent Malsha Pathiraja from Kursk in Russia. The International Criminal Court is also involving itself in the dire situation of Ukraine as visuals continue to display civilians turning victim to lethal airstrikes by Russia.
Video of Ukrainian emergency services trying to rescue civilians from a burning building following a Russian airstrike in the city of Chernihiv are the latest images of horror and suffering brought on by Russia's invasion. And now that investigators from the International Criminal Court in The Hague are en route to the region looking into possible war crimes.
We're moving to the region today. They're taking off probably about now.
ICC prosecutor Karim Khan told his office would be examining possible war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
I think the world is watching, and the world expects better. Humanity expects better than we're getting around the world, and Ukraine is no exception.
Neither Russia nor Ukraine are members of the ICC, and Moscow does not recognize the court. But Ukraine signed a declaration in 2014 giving the court jurisdiction over alleged grave crimes committed on its territory, regardless of the nationality of the perpetrators.
Kharkiv, the 3rd of March, the 7th day of Russian war and Russian war crimes.
Video shot Thursday by a resident of Kharkiv showed the effect of Russian bombs on residential neighborhoods. But Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday said his soldiers were trying to avoid civilian casualties and said what he calls the special operation in Ukraine was going, quote, according to plan. Russia has been accused of using what are called cluster munitions and of targeting civilian neighborhoods. Khan did not address specific allegations, but said this.
Well, one thing is very clear. Any side that directly targets civilians or civilian objects are committing a crime under the Rome Statute and under international humanitarian law. That much is clear.
If war crimes are found to have been committed in Ukraine, Khan said his office would follow the evidence up the chain of command to the highest levels of political and military office.
There may, however, be an effort to minimize casualties as the two sides agree to plan to establish a humanitarian corridor for evacuating civilians while the attacks continue. Ukraine and Russia ended a second round of ceasefire talks on the 8th day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Kyiv says the talks did not yield the results that it hoped for, but the two sides have agreed on a tentative plan to create a humanitarian corridor for evacuating civilians. Russia's negotiator described it as substantial progress.
So the sides, representatives of the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation and Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, have agreed on the format for humanitarian corridors for civilians to leave and possibly stopping military action in the area as civilians leave. I think it is substantial progress.
Despite peace talks, Moscow's forces carried on with assaults on Ukrainian cities, including Mariupol, which is the main port city in the east. Russian military had also entered the southern city of Enerhodar, the site of the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, which is responsible for about 1/4 of the country's power generation. Russian forces said they had seized Kherson on Thursday, the first major Ukrainian city to fall, and have taken over local government headquarters in the Black Sea port city of roughly 280,000 people. Also, Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, was continuously bombarded. Around 1 million people have fled Ukraine, according to the United Nations, since the start of the Russian attack. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he's willing to have an open conversation with Russia's President Vladimir Putin.
It's not about I want to talk with Putin. I think I have to talk with Putin. The world has to talk with Putin because there are no other ways to stop this war. That's why I have to.
As the war advances, the U.S. created a new hotline with Russia's Ministry of Defense on Thursday in order to prevent miscalculation, military incidents, and escalation. Despite such efforts, the UN General Assembly voted to reprimand Russia for the invasion. The resolution was supported by 141 of the Assembly's 193 members.
Applause ended more than 2 days of debate, delivering a powerful rebuke of Russia from the UN General Assembly. A resolution condemning Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, saying the body, quote, deplores in the strongest terms the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. In an overwhelming show of support, 141 of the 193 nations voted in favor. 5 voted against: Eritrea, North Korea, Syria, Belarus, and of course, Russia. China was among the 35 countries that abstained.
The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now. Silence the guns now. Open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the resolution, passed in a rare emergency session, brings with it a sense of urgency.
But as bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much, much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb.
Russia claims it is acting in self-defense under the UN Charter, an assertion roundly rejected by the General Assembly.
We have demonstrated that Russia is isolated and alone. And that's the cost, that the costs will keep rising until Russia relents.
Russia's UN envoy accused the West of pressuring other countries to support the resolution, which he says could fuel further violence.
This document will not allow us to end military activities. On the contrary, it could embolden Kiev radicals and nationalists to act at any price, holding peaceful civilians hostage.
Ahead of the vote, Ukraine's ambassador said Russia was trying to rob Kiev of its right to exist, calling the invasion an attempt at genocide.
The United States has also announced new sanctions on more than a dozen Russian oligarchs and their families, on top of the sweeping punitive measures it imposed on Moscow earlier this week following the invasion.
The Biden administration has imposed sweeping sanctions on 19 wealthy Russian individuals and 47 of their family members, as well as their close associates, as part of additional U.S. penalties on Moscow for invading Ukraine.
What we're talking about here is seizing their assets, seizing their yachts, and making it harder for them to send, their children to colleges and universities in the West. These are significant steps that will impact the people who are closely around President Putin.
They include the Kremlin spokesperson and Alisher Usmanov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia. Britain has also newly sanctioned 2 billionaire allies of Putin, including the former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. They'll be subject to full asset freezes and travel bans. These individuals have already been sanctioned by the EU. Brussels is also seeking to remove Russia's most favored nation status at the World Trade Organization. The move is expected to sharply hike tariffs on Russia's exports to the EU. It also said it's ready to take additional steps against Moscow if needed.
And we will take additional steps if the situation deteriorates on the ground. At the same time, we are preparing in case of retaliation. In particular, we are working to diversify our energy supplies. We discussed it.
Meanwhile, the UN nuclear watchdog says its board of directors has backed a resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The resolution calling for Moscow to let Ukraine control all its nuclear facilities was passed on Thursday at an emergency meeting of the IAEA. 26 of the 35-nation board supported the resolution. Russia and China voted against it.
Let's go in for a short commercial break. You're watching World News. Welcome back to World News Tonight. Meanwhile, Ukraine is putting up every defense possible, including on a technology level. The country is collaborating with the United States to ensure better firewall protection, to prevent a possible breach, and also to better detect oncoming threats.
Before Russia mounted its ground offensive in Ukraine, the leading edge of its assault was detected thousands of miles away. Alarm bells went off at Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center in Redmond, Washington, over a new piece of malware aimed at Ukraine's government and financial institutions. Microsoft jumped into the digital fray, picking apart the malware, alerting Ukraine's cyber defenders and the top cyber official at the White House.
When Microsoft notified us that they built signatures to identify the destructive malware, we encouraged sharing that broadly across allies and partners.
U.S. officials warn that Vladimir Putin still has the ability to cut off critical communications and cripple vital infrastructure in Ukraine. But so far, Russia's cyber offensive has been limited to denial of service attacks on Ukraine's defense ministry and banks. The U.S. is working with Ukraine's cyber defenses to be ready in case the worst is still to come.
Russia has one of the most sophisticated cyber programs in the world, and it's far easier to attack than to defend. An attacker has to be successful once, a defender has to be successful every time.
Yet another automobile giant is joining the great Russian exit. Toyota is among the many companies choosing to halt its production and export services in the country, adding to the financial toll Russia has to bear in response to the invasion.
Japan's big car makers are joining global rivals in ending output in Russia. After saying recently that production continued as normal, Toyota has now bowed to the inevitable. The world's biggest car maker says it stopped production in the country. It normally makes about 80,000 cars a year at its St. Petersburg plant, employing 2,000 workers. Toyota also said it would halt all exports to Russia. That follows similar moves by local rivals Honda and Mazda. Big car makers elsewhere had already acted. Ford, BMW and Mercedes-Benz were among those to stop making cars in Russia or halting exports to it. Sanctions on the country have scrambled logistics and cut supply chains, making life difficult for manufacturers. The exclusion of Russian banks from international financial systems also complicates making payments. Toyota said it was watching events in Ukraine with great concern and hoped for a swift return to peace.
Over now in Australia, things still seem grim as authorities warned of more rains over the weekend in several flooded regions in the country's east, likely hampering relief efforts as defense personnel try to reach the worst-hit towns cut off by days of downpours. A wild weather system that dumped more than a year's worth of rainfall over a week in several places in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales brought widespread destruction, leaving thousands of people displaced and sweeping away property, livestock and roads. 13 people so far have been killed since the deluge began. Flood evacuation warnings were revised down from some parts in Sydney, Australia's largest city, but the Bureau of Meteorology said a new weather system could bring around another round of heavy rains. Australia's East Coast summer has been dominated by the La Nina weather pattern, typically associated with increased rainfall, with many rivers already near capacity before the latest drenching after steady rains over the last few weeks. Officials warn of worse to come, and some 500,000 people are likely to face orders to evacuate. The floods are suspected to be a result of increasing tolls due to climate change. French President Emmanuel Macron announced he would run for a second term in the April French presidential election, seeking a mandate to steer the Eurozone's second-largest economy through the fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic.
At just 39 years old, Emmanuel Macron arrived at the Élysée Palace as France's youngest president, marking a meteoric rise in French politics. He studied philosophy and public affairs at the graduate level before being admitted to the École nationale d'administration, France's elite school for the training of civil servants. After working for the investment bank Rothschild, he eventually landed the role of Deputy Secretary General of the Élysée at the age of 34, under Socialist President François Hollande, becoming one of his closest advisors. 2 years later, Macron was appointed finance minister, continuing his political climb and catching the attention of the media. In 2016, he launched his political movement En Marche, the party name mirroring his own initials. The move distanced him from his socialist predecessor, Hollande. Critical of certain labor policies hailed by the Socialist Party, such as the 35-hour work week, Macron has called for more flexibility for companies as a means of fighting unemployment. In the 2017 election, he beat far-right candidate Marine Le Pen to win the presidency in a groundbreaking poll that shut out the country's traditional left and right-wing parties from the second round of voting for the first time in nearly 60 years. Several crises have marked his term, from the Yellow Vest movement, to the Benalla affair, to pension reform protests, to the coronavirus pandemic. Throughout the challenges, Macron has faced growing criticism. Responding to backlash, his comments have been viewed as condescending by his opponents. The last 2 years of his term focused largely on COVID-19. Central to his pandemic strategy, vaccination and pressuring those who haven't got the jab. Now officially seeking re-election, Macron is hoping to claim what eluded his two predecessors, François Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy, a second term in office.
Welcome back to World News Tonight. For more news, let's take you around the world in a minute. India evacuated more of its nationals, including students, from Ukraine as the country entered its second week of war with Russia. Special flights, including Indian Air Force aircrafts, are making rounds to bring its people back home from the war-hit country. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency will visit Tehran, raising the prospects of the possible revival of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. In a statement released by IAEA, Rafael Grossi will meet with senior Iranian officials to discuss outstanding safeguard issues. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake hit Veracruz state in southeast Mexico, fortunately leading to no injuries or significant damage. The quake set off seismic alarms as far away as Mexico City. IKEA, the world's biggest furniture brand, is closing its stores in Russia and pausing all sourcing in the country and its ally, Belarus. joining the wave of Western firms curbing the business with Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. Russia's parliament passed a law imposing a jail term of up to 15 years for spreading intentionally fake information about the armed forces as Moscow fights back in what it casts as information war over the conflict in Ukraine. Arrangements are being made to help as many as 20,000 Ukrainian tourists stranded in Egyptian resorts to fly to Europe, adding that many were ready to head to Ukraine to fight Russian forces. Sales of imported cars in South Korea took a hit in February on the continuing shortage of auto ships around the globe. The number of imported vehicles newly registered in February came on an on-year decrease of 12.7%. And that's all the news we got for you tonight. Join us again tomorrow for more news around the globe. In case you've missed any of the stories we had tonight, you can rewatch by catching us on our YouTube page, youtube.com/Derana English. We're leaving you tonight with ice skaters twinkling away as they dazzle the frozen...